Welcome to this lecture on the principles of ecology. Today, we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and vital concepts in nature, food webs. If you have ever wondered how ecosystems survive constant changes, from droughts to the loss of a species, the answer lies in these complex networks. By the end of this session, you will understand not just what a food web is, but how we can mathematically measure its strength. To start, let us imagine you are navigating through a bustling city using a GPS map on your phone. If a major highway is suddenly closed due to construction, you do not just give up and stay stuck forever. Instead, you find an alternate route through smaller streets to reach your destination. Nature works in a very similar and brilliant way when it comes to how animals get their food. Instead of a single straight line of who eats whom, animals have multiple choices and backup plans for their meals. This massive, tangled network of eating relationships is nature's ultimate backup system. Now that we have a conceptual picture, let us look at the formal ecological definition. In ecological terms, a food web is a complex, interconnected network of multiple food chains within a specific ecosystem. While a simple food chain shows a single linear pathway of energy flow, like grass being eaten by a rabbit, which is then eaten by a fox, a food web illustrates all the possible pathways of energy and nutrient transfer. By overlapping these chains, the food web reveals that most organisms consume more than one type of prey and are, in turn, consumed by multiple predators. Building on that definition, we must understand how these networks are structured. A food web maps out feeding relationships across different trophic levels. These are the hierarchical levels in an ecosystem, starting from producers like plants at the very bottom, all the way up to apex predators at the top. This intricate branching structure provides a highly realistic and comprehensive picture of community dynamics. Ultimately, it demonstrates how energy originating from the sun is distributed, utilized, and recycled throughout the entire biological community. Understanding this structure leads us to ask why food webs are so absolutely crucial. They are essentially the blueprint of ecosystem stability and resilience. In the real world, environments are constantly changing due to droughts, diseases, or human impacts, which can cause certain species populations to drop drastically. If an ecosystem relied on simple, straight food chains, the loss of one species would cause a domino effect, starving everything above it. However, because a food web offers multiple feeding links, predators can simply shift their diet to a more abundant species, preventing the entire system from collapsing. Following up on ecosystem stability, this brings us to how scientists actually use this knowledge in the field. Conservationists and ecologists actively use food webs as predictive tools. By mapping out these networks, they can predict exactly how the extinction of a single species will ripple through the environment. Similarly, they can forecast the devastating impacts of introducing an invasive species. Without the concept of the food web, we would be completely blind to the hidden connections that keep our planet's ecosystems alive and functioning. This predictive power is essential for modern conservation efforts. This resilience we just discussed can actually be measured mathematically. To truly understand how robust or fragile a food web is, ecologists use a measurement called connectance. Conceptually, connectance tells us what fraction of all possible feeding relationships actually exist in a given ecosystem. The formula is C equals L divided by S squared. Here, C represents the connectance, which is always a fraction between 0 and 1. The variable L stands for the actual number of feeding links observed between the species. The variable S represents the total number of species present. When the actual links increase, connectance increases, indicating a more stable ecosystem. Let us apply this formula to a basic numerical example to see how it works in practice. Imagine a small pond ecosystem that contains exactly 5 different species, so S equals 5. After careful observation, an ecologist determines there are exactly 10 actual feeding links, meaning L equals 10. We are asked to calculate the connectance. First, we find the maximum possible links by squaring the number of species, which gives us 25. Next, we divide the actual links, 10, by the maximum links, 25. This gives a final connectance of 0.40. This means 40% of all possible feeding relationships actually exist here, indicating a highly interconnected and stable pond. Now that we have successfully used the formula, let us take a moment to understand where that denominator comes from. Why do we divide by S squared? This chunk of our mathematical model establishes the absolute theoretical maximum number of feeding links. If you have a certain number of species, imagine a hypothetical scenario where every single species ate everything else in the ecosystem. Each species would have a feeding link with every other species, and even a link with itself, representing cannibalism. Mathematically, you multiply the number of species by the number of species, giving S squared. Finding this theoretical maximum is a necessary baseline before we can evaluate the actual complexity of the web. With that deeper understanding of the math, let us apply this to a more complex, real-world comparison to see why connectance matters for conservation. Suppose we have a heavily managed agricultural farm. We are given that it has 4 species and only 3 feeding links. We need to calculate its connectance. We square the 4 species to get a maximum of 16 possible links. Dividing the 3 actual links by 16 gives us a connectance of approximately 0.1875. This tells us that less than 19% of possible connections exist. Such a low number is very typical for artificial, human-managed environments, where biodiversity is intentionally kept low. Now, let us compare that farm to a neighboring wild forest to determine which is more vulnerable to environmental shocks. The forest has 10 species and 20 feeding links. We square the 10 species to get a maximum of 100 possible links. Dividing the 20 actual links by 100 gives us a connectance of exactly 0.20. This means 20% of all possible feeding relationships are actively occurring. Although the numbers seem close to the farm, the forest has a much larger total number of alternative pathways. If just one link in the farm is broken, the system collapses, whereas the forest has the resilience to absorb such shocks. To truly grasp how these links and nodes interact, it is incredibly helpful to look at a visual map of a food web. What you are seeing here is a terrestrial food web diagram. At the very bottom, we have our producers, the green plants. Notice the arrows pointing upwards. These represent the exact paths of energy flowing from the plants to primary consumers, like the rabbit, mouse, and grasshopper. From there, the energy flows to secondary consumers, and finally up to the apex predator, the hawk. By seeing these overlapping arrows, you can instantly understand why an ecosystem is more than just a simple chain. It makes the abstract math we just calculated completely visible. We have covered a lot of ground today. So let us review the most important ideas. First, a food web is a comprehensive map of all the interconnected feeding relationships within an ecosystem, moving far beyond the simplistic idea of a straight food chain. Second, we learned that we can measure these tangled pathways using connectance, which mathematically gauges the health, complexity, and stability of an environment. Finally, remember that the more interconnected a food web is, the better equipped the ecosystem is to survive environmental changes and protect its biodiversity. You now have a solid understanding of how nature builds resilience.